Lewis so close to the podium, but still before, do you think you did all the good calls at the right moment today?
Not all of them. I think the first one wasn't a good call, clearly, because we got undercut by a bunch of people, so I'm not really sure what exactly happened there.
Le premier n'était pas bon, on s'est retrouvé derrière plein de gens, je ne sais pas ce qui s'est passé exactement à ce moment-là. Il faudra qu'on revoie ce qui s'est passé, mais quand je suis ressorti quatrième, j'étais quatrième et je suis ressorti huitième. J'ai choisi de rentrer quasiment au bon moment, mais c'était très très serré et finalement j'ai perdu beaucoup de temps, notamment au virage 3, au virage 9, je suis parti à la faute au virage 11, donc c'était un peu tôt. C'est là que vous avez perdu le podium sur Hülkenberg.
Are we witnessing the beginning of the end between Lewis Hamilton and Ferrari? How is it possible that a 7-time world champion ends up disobeying orders in their own home in Silverstone and breaks the relationship with his engineer in full race? The answer is in a strategy disaster, absurd decisions, and a structure that is falling apart from within. In the midst of a career marked by climatic uncertainty and strategic decisions to the limit, Ferrari made a decision that broke the entire delicate balance. The Italian wall asked Hamilton to enter boxes for the second time, although his tires were still inside a functional window. The answer was immediate and loaded with tension. My tires are fine. Can I extend? How many more laps are left? He asked on a radio with a tone that, although still diplomat, betrayed annoyance. But when the order remained without convincing technical argument, the tension became an open challenge. I don't want to stop, he said. There was no suggestion, no doubt it was a categorical negative. That phrase, in simple appearance, is actually a political bomb within the Ferrari ecosystem. Because not only represents tactical disobedience, but a direct rejection of the authority of Riccardo Adami, his career engineer. A figure that, until now, had been its technical interlocutor during the races, but that in the last large awards had become a symbol of the internal chaos of the team. The radio silenced after that message. There was no insistence. There was no reply. Just silence. And that silence says more than 1,000 messages. What happened at that time was more than a disagreement. It was an emotional break between a legendary pilot and a team that still fails to understand how to manage the talent of a champion. Because this was not the first time that Hamilton publicly questioned the strategy. Already in Austria, just a race before, I had dropped a very hard phrase, I don't want to reach a point where I am ignoring them. And now, in the most significant career of his personal calendar, that point came. But it was not only an impulsive response in the heat of the moment. He noticed in his body language, in the gestures inside the cockpit, in how he pressed his fists even after going through the finish line. Hamilton was completely out of his own. The fury was evident, and not only with the punctual strategy, but with what this strategy symbolized. Disorganization, lack of vision, a total disconnection between pilot and wall. Ferrari had turned a strategic situation into a public humiliation of his star. And the most worrying thing is that, unlike previous years, this time Hamilton did not hold back in the subsequent interviews. Although diplomat in words, his gaze, his tone, and his body language transmitted a mixture of disappointment and warning. Silverstone was not just a boxing error, it was a breakdown that questioned whether this alliance can survive the remaining calendar. In the background, what we are seeing with Ferrari is not simply a series of strategic errors or bad boxes. It is a reflection of a much deeper problem. A broken technical structure that has been accumulating cracks for years, and that in this 2025 season has begun to collapse under the weight of its own unfulfilled promises. Because if something has been clear after what happened with Lewis Hamilton in Silverstone, it is that Ferrari does not have a solid base on which to build a winning season, much less a campaign that is up to a pilot like him. Since the beginning of the season, the SF-25 has been marked by technical inconsistencies that are not explained solely by a matter of tuning. In fact, according to internal sources of the equipment and analysis filtered after the training prior to the GP of Great Britain, the true car heel of the car is not in its aerodynamics as many thought, but a critical component, the rear suspension. This failure is not anecdotal. It is a design defect that causes an estimated loss of performance in half a second per lap. Half second. In a category where differences are measured in thousands, that is directly a competitive death sentence. The worst thing is that Ferrari knows it. Loic Serra, the technical director who arrived with the mission of renewing the architecture of the car, has been developing a radical solution for this problem for weeks. It is a completely redesigned suspension that aims to maximize the pro-squat effect, that is, that car's ability to settle correctly under acceleration in the exit of slow curves, where the SF-25 loses more time. The concept is ambitious, even inspired by what Mercedes implemented in Imola. But that solution, which should arrive in Silverstone, has been delayed and will not reach the Belgium Grand Prix. Meanwhile, Ferrari is forced to compete with a car that simply is not up to it, not only from Red Bull or McLaren, but even from Mercedes in certain paths. And this technical gap does not affect all its pilots equally, because the new package, with its tendency to lift the rear train under braking, could benefit Charles Leclerc, whose aggressive driving style on the front axle tolerates a more loose rear train. But for Hamilton, which has historically required total stability in the rear to maximize its performance, this type of behavior is a direct enemy. In other words, SF-25 is evolving in a direction that favors Leclerc, and Hamilton's life further complicates. What is alarming is that this technical divergence does not seem to be accidental. In Ferrari, there are voices that begin to talk about an orientation of development centered almost exclusively on Leclerc, which leaves Hamilton in an uncomfortable position, running with a car that is not built for him, receiving instructions that he does not share, and adapt to a philosophy that marginalizes it tactically. This generates a vicious circle of frustration, distrust, and operational failures that end up exploding, as we saw in Silverstone. And while all this happens, Ferrari's organizational structure remains as rigid as opaque. Technical roles are poorly defined, strategic hierarchies are confusing, and crucial decisions are made without coherence between track, simulation, and development departments. In other words, Ferrari continues to operate as if he were in a past era of F1, where individual talent could compensate for the lack of structure. But that today, in 2025, is simply not sustainable. Not against McLaren, not against Red Bull, not against Mercedes. And much less with a pilot like Hamilton, whose technical and mental demand requires an impeccably professional environment. This is the root of the problem. It is not a bad stop. It is not a radio mistake. It is a system that is not working, that does not adapt to its pilots, and that, if it is not reformed from within, runs the risk of burying Ferrari again in another decade of broken promises. What happened in Silverstone has lit a wick that nobody inside Ferrari seems able to turn off. The internal storm is not a dramatic metaphor, it is a tangible reality within Maranello's box. And the epicenter of that storm is Lewis Hamilton. Not because it is he who has caused her, but because her level of demand and her history of excellence make intolerable what Ferrari today is offering. Since his arrival to the team, the British has maintained his composure, he has been patient with adaptation, he has accepted the technical challenge of driving a car that was not made to measure. But everything has a limit, and that limit has been reached. To understand the seriousness of what is happening, you have to observe beyond the result of a single grand prize. The progressive deterioration of the relationship between Hamilton and Ferrari must be understood as a chain of disappointments that began in the preseason tests and have accumulated career after a career. Already in Australia, Lewis's official debut with SF-25 was a attention call. The car did not respond, the strategy was erratic, and the general sensation was that Hamilton was trying to assemble a puzzle with pieces that did not fit. Now, the big question is not just how Ferrari will answer, but what Hamilton will do. Because what is at stake is not simply a season. It is the integrity of its legacy. A champion of his caliber cannot afford to waste his last stage in the elite being a victim of incoherent strategic decisions or of a poorly developed car. And the most worrying thing is that Ferrari, in its current state, does not have agility or internal coherence to offer quick solutions. So what is coming now? A radical change in Ferrari's technical direction? A complete adjustment in car development philosophy? Or maybe something more drastic? Because if the situation does not improve soon, it is not unreasonable to imagine that Hamilton begins to evaluate other options. Options that, although difficult, cannot be discarded by someone who still firmly believes that he has what is necessary to win an 8th title. What has happened in Silverstone is not simply one more anecdote within an intense season. It is a warning. A sign that one of the most ambitious projects of modern Formula One, the signing of Lewis Hamilton by Ferrari, runs the risk of crumbling before consolidating. And the question is now inevitable. What will Hamilton do? Are you going to redouble your commitment to Ferrari, continue demanding changes, and drag the team towards a structural transformation that allows you to compete at the highest level? Or are we seeing the first steps towards an inevitable breakup, towards an outcome that could shake the foundations of the pilot market and change the narrative of your career forever? Because we are not talking about any pilot. We are talking about the man who redefined Formula One in the hybrid era, of the most laureate pilot in history in terms of poles, victories, and podiums. Someone who built a legacy about constancy, precision, and the ability to perform under pressure like no other. And that same pilot today is surrounded by uncertainty. Not due to lack of talent, but for lack of structure. Not for their own errors, but by poorly founded decisions that have compromised their career performance after career. And this is where you enter. What would you do if you were Lewis Hamilton? Would you persist in Ferrari waiting for everything to change? Or would you look for a new beginning in another team, even if that implies starting again from scratch? Leave me your answer in the comments.